Good evening. I'm Dr. Darlene Rossetti, the Regional Superintendent of DuPage County Schools. I want to welcome our live stream viewers. We hope you enjoyed last week's session, which was the first in our series. And if you missed it, you can find it on District 41 or the DuPage ROE YouTube channels. That session laid an excellent foundation to teach us how times of crisis, such as the one we're currently facing, affect the human psyche, and how we can not only survive but thrive during these challenging days. I want to thank Dr. Zarse for being here again, District 41, especially Superintendent Dr. Kieskowski for their leadership. And now I'm going to turn this over to Mike Roby.
Thank you, Dr. Rossetti. We are recording this live stream and it will be available on both the DuPage ROE website and the District 41 websites on both of our YouTube channels as well. If you have any questions throughout or even after this session, please email us at DuPageStrong, that's DuPageStrong, DuPageStrong at DuPageROE.org. We will be compiling the questions throughout this segment and throughout this session tonight into different categories. And at the end, we may be answering them or we may not. Please remember that your exact question may or may not be answered depending upon the unique nature of your question or for any confidentiality reasons. But you will receive an answer tonight. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Kieskowski.
Thank you, Mike. Before we get started, I wanted to take a minute and thank the law firm of Franzik for sponsoring this event, along with the DuPage ROE. Dana Fator-Crumley is with us tonight. Dana, we may drag you into this when we have some questions maybe to send your way. But thank you again for helping us to make these series of sessions happen. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, I wanted to share some of the context of District 41's relationship with Dr. Zarse. Earlier this year, we had an opportunity to see Dr. Zarse present at a workshop that was hosted by our law firm. And we were so impressed with her skills and experiences and just her storytelling and thought she would be an amazing asset to bring to Glen Ellen. So we were emailing her before the session was even over and asking her if she works directly with school districts and would she be willing to work with us? And we were very fortunate that she said yes, and that we did bring her on board to work with District 41 as a consultant to help us do our training and get our threat assessment plan pulled together and do ongoing training and support with our staff. A few months back, I don't think any of us foresaw this ever happening. So when COVID-19 became a reality and we were working really hard to shut schools down literally overnight and do that well, Dr. Zarse reached out and said, would you like to pull something together to serve the community of Glen Ellen? And so we had the opportunity to do this and took that idea to Darlene through the regional office and really wanted to do something that would be bigger than just District 41. And now, from what I understand, even bigger than DuPage County, because we have people watching from all over the place tonight. So that's a little bit of the context of how we got to know Nancy Zarse and how she got to know us. The short introduction is Dr. Zarse is an expert in the field of threat assessment and crisis. And our last session, we really talked about how this crisis impacts you psychologically and how we can work to thrive as a community to come through this. And tonight, from what I understand, we're going to talk more about the topic of resilience. So I'm going to turn it over to Nancy.
Thank you very much. I am honored to be here. I want to say that I appreciate everyone who's watching, who's partaking of this, but I also want to give a hats off, if you will, to District 41, to the DuPage Regional Office of Education, and to Franzik Law Firm for being willing to support the multiple layers of this crisis and our response to it. And so the series is on surviving and thriving in the face of crisis. And what we're going to focus on tonight is resilience. And as I think about what I bring to the table tonight, in addition to a 30-year career as a forensic psychologist, two pieces of my career in particular come to bear here. And the first is the Israel program. I created a program on Israel that focuses on terrorism, trauma, and resilience within the context of Israel. So a 14-week on-ground course that culminates in a 10-day study abroad trip to Israel. And I've been running that program now for a decade. And what that allows is a real emphasis, not just on the trauma, but on the resilience. And so if you think about what we're talking about here in this series, it's not just the crisis, it's how do we survive the crisis. And the second part that I am drawing heavily upon is a course that I'm preparing for Great Courses that is on survivor mentality, the psychology of staying alive. And so those two pieces and what I've learned from talking to survivors personally is what we're going to emphasize tonight. So let's jump right in. Resilience. That's the topic of what we're really focusing on tonight. Resilience is a dynamic process of healthy adaptation when faced with significant adversity. And all three elements of that definition are relevant here. The first, the part that it's dynamic. It evolves over time. It is a process. It's not an event. It's not an end journey. I mean, it's not an end date. It's a process. So there's going to be good days and bad. There's going to be days when you feel like you're more on top of things than others. So that dynamic process, the healthy adaptation. There's a number of things that we can do that are not healthy when we're faced with crisis. And so what we're trying to promote here with this series is how do we do this in a healthy way? And how do we pull together as a community? And then the significant adversity. One of my brothers said to me one time, well, Nance, the best way to have resilience is to not have adversity. Okay, except for the fact that that's not the definition of resilience. And I don't know what sky you're living under to think that none of us are going to have adversity. I mean, right now we have extraordinary adversity, and we have that adversity on a community level, on a city, on a state, in America, all across America, but even, let's be real, on a global level right now. But we don't even have to go that big. And everything that we talk about tonight is going to generalize to any kind of significant adversity that you face in your life. If somebody is diagnosed with cancer, if you have an unexpected death, any of those major kind of events are things that can apply to the material that we're talking about tonight. And so a couple of the things that I want to highlight, resilience includes general resourcefulness, sturdiness, and flexibility. And what we have found, we used to think that people just pretty much survived crisis, but what we are discovering is that some people actually have post-trauma growth. So they grow from their experiences and they literally emerge stronger and more capable than they went into it. So let's break all three of those down. General resourcefulness. These are the kinds of folks that when they see a problem, they immediately seek a solution. And a lot of us, maybe we see a problem and we get overwhelmed, or we see a problem and we just feel like that one is insurmountable. These folks, the ones with general resourcefulness, continue to look for that solution. And it's connected to that internal locus of control that we talked about last week. And I'm going to give a little reminder, just in case people forgot. That's kind of an unusual concept. And what we find is that these folks that are generally resourceful and have that internal locus of control are also more open to creativity and to learning. And if you think about that, again, learning is a lifelong process. You know, if we think about any of our students that might be on this avenue tonight, they might be thinking of it's grade school, it's high school, it's college, it's graduate school, but it's not. We are lifelong learners. And the more we are open to that concept, the more we expand the breadth of our knowledge and we gather additional experiences, all of which then we can bring to bear in the face of adversity. And so what that does is ensure a number of coping mechanisms. So maybe we try this in that circumstance, but over here we have a completely different strategy because it's a different crisis. It has different particulars. And so we're going to adapt to whatever that one is. And the other thing about coping mechanisms is that we need to remember that we're going to need to cope during the crisis, and then we're going to need to cope after the crisis. So if you take the global pandemic that we're up against here, there are significant conversations, not just about how do we get through this moment or this month, how do we get through this period of time, but how do we get our engines up and running again after the crisis passes and it is safe for us to be back out in the communities. Okay, so I'm going to review that locus of control. Locus of control is what you believe about the connection between your behavior and then what happens afterwards. And there are two types of locus of control. There is an internal locus of control and an external locus of control. So let's start with the internal. The internal is if I believe that a great deal of what happens in my life flows from my actions. So obviously notice me, even my hands are pointing inward. With an external locus of control, I assume that what's happening to me is the result of other people or fate or things that are happening out there that really are kind of beyond my control. With an internal locus of control, even though maybe I don't control the event, I control my actions to that event. So take the global pandemic. We have no control over that. Nobody on this call has any control over the coronavirus itself. We don't have that kind of control. But what we do have control over is what we do in response. So really think social distancing. It is one of the single biggest ways that we can demonstrate locus of control, an internal locus of control, because that is something that I have control over. And here's an interesting picture of an internal locus of control. And I think it's actually an interesting picture twice. Notice that the medical professionals are saying, we stay here for you, so please stay home for us. One, I love the resourcefulness of this picture. They're trying to bring the message home to us, and they're doing it in a way that reminds us of their sacrifice in keeping us safe. Kind of puts that in perspective, doesn't it? Isn't it a little bit easier for me to just be inconvenienced in my own home than it is for them to risk their own lives and the lives of their families by helping to save us? So I love this picture of the duality of an internal locus of control and how they're being really creative in getting that message across to us. Now we've got sturdiness. So think sturdiness the way you would with a chair. A sturdy chair is physically sturdy. It can carry a lot of weight. The same concept applies to a sturdy person. It's not about whether physically I'm a sturdy person. It's that I am strong in the face of psychological stress. And in fact, what we find in the research is that sturdy people don't even see the event itself as disturbing as other people. And because of that, they feel more confident in their ability to navigate, to circumvent, if you will, whatever is in front of them. And what we find is that those qualities also lead to a quicker recovery after the crisis. Because again, most crises, if they are that kind of significant adversity, are going to have aftershocks in our lives. The third quality that we talked about here is flexibility. And that is your ability to think outside the box, to see the options and to pursue the solutions that follow from them. And oftentimes other people just don't see them. And we find that flexibility helps people both during the actual crisis, but also after the crisis. Because if you think about it, we don't know how it might affect us in the long run. If you look again at the global pandemic that we are in right now, we don't know what the long-term effects are going to be physically. We don't know what the long-term effects are going to be financially. So there's parts of this that we literally just cannot predict. And what that also brings to mind is that we need to be able to figure out the coping strategies that work right now, what's effective and what is not, with the understanding that that is going to evolve over time. So I'm, for instance, about 3 weeks into my sequestering. So what I've been doing for the first 3 weeks is probably going to be different. I'm going to need to come up with some new strategies in the next 3 weeks. And I can't quite yet see around whatever that curve in the road is. So I'm just going to need to know and be reliant upon the fact that I'm going to have to think outside the box. And quite frankly, there might be days when I'm a little bit stumped. And so I'm going to draw on my resources. What are you guys doing? What's going on over there? So we've got our plan A. I love this concept. My father used to talk about it. He used to say that you got to have a plan. A plan motivates you, it keeps you moving, but you also have to be able to be prepared to adapt. So what's plan B? Okay, I'm going to give a story. If anybody heard last week, we had a story. We're going to talk about another story of significant adversity. In that program that I talked about, that survivor mentality, I traveled around the country and I did a number of interviews of survivors. And one of the groups that I wanted to get access to are firefighters. And I'm kind of fortunate. I've got a connection. The guy there in the uniform with the baby in his helmet happens to be my nephew, and that is Captain Zarse. And he works for Dallas Fire Rescue. So we were able to secure approval for me to come down to Dallas and interview a number of firefighters and also to do a 22-hour ride along with the Dallas Fire Rescue Department. And so that picture, the two pictures on the left are my nephew, Captain Zarse, sounds much more official, doesn't it? In the engine, and then I'm in the back as we're responding to a call. What I want to introduce you to is Jeff Patterson. He is an extraordinary example of significant adversity. So Jeff was on call one night. It was now about 6 o'clock at night, and they got a call and they responded to a structure fire. And it was a one-story occupied house. Jeff was the second engine to arrive. He, a lieutenant, and another firefighter grabbed a hose, they grabbed a line, and they went into the building, into the house. And they did what was really kind of standard procedure. You pull the ceiling, you look for the fire, and they found that the fire was in the back of the house, back by the kitchen, so they moved towards the back. Now, meanwhile, they're inside the house. On the outside of the house, the chief was doing what they call a 360. So he walks around the entire perimeter of the building to size up the situation. And he realized that the fire was worse than they originally thought. And so he put a radio call out, everybody out of the house, everybody out. So Jeff and his team turn and they start to move towards the front of the house. And suddenly the conditions get very bad, very, very quickly. And what happened was that suddenly they can't see anything. The smoke is so thick that they cannot see in front of them. And then it gets even worse. The ceiling, there had been an add-on in that particular building. The roof and the ceiling suddenly hinged in and the roof collapsed on them. So the ceiling collapses on the firefighter. And immediately, those of you who might remember what we talked about last week, in the face of a crisis, we have three responses: our physical, our cognitive, our emotional. Jeff immediately went in to the physical fight or flight response, immediately mobilized that physical response to his crisis. Now, again, the smoke was so thick, he could not find the front door, and he could feel the fire. It was getting very, very hot, and he was increasingly becoming uncomfortable. And at one point, he actually remembers thinking, I'm going to die. This is it. And he could feel the fire. He could feel the fire through his gloves. He could feel the fire coming in through his mask. He could feel the fire on his back. And then he remembers, he thought of his children and he thought of his wife. And he thought, no, this is not going to happen. I am not going to die today. I am not going out like this. So at that point, he relied on his previous experiences. He had been an athlete. He was actually a collegiate football player. And in his view, the way he described himself was, he said, I'm a fighter. He said, and I was tough. He prided himself on that notion, I'm tough. Now, what was interesting for Jeff is tough allowed for the fact that he was going to get knocked down. But to him, being tough meant that he was going to get back up again. And so at that moment, when he first thought, I'm going to die, this is it, he now had to decide, am I going to sit here and die, or am I going to fight and try to find my way out? And so he started clawing, and he started digging, and he starts moving. And remember, the smoke is so thick he can't see. And at one point, he remembers rolling off of something. They figured out later it was the dining room table. And all the while, as he continues to use his hands are burning more and more, and he can feel the fire on his hands. Luckily, he had the rare, okay, so he also told me, and I didn't know this, so maybe you don't either, that firefighters' gear is rated to 500 degrees. Seems like a lot. When the ceiling dropped and the fire flashed in that house, the temperature rose to between 800 and 1,000 degrees. So he, as Jeff described it, he's got a bit of a sense of humor. As Jeff described it, I was basically cooking like a potato. Isn't that an interesting visual? So as he feels the fire, he had the wherewithal to fight his natural instinct to take off his gloves and to take off his mask. He stayed with it, but he could also feel that the oxygen tank on his back was getting so hot that it was heating up the air, and he was now pulling hot air into his lungs, and he could feel it. He could feel the fire, the heat singeing his lungs. And he knew, I have to get the heck out of here. So again, outside the fire, they've now done a head count. They realize that they're missing Jeff. And so they start to gear up to come back into the fire to find him. And as one of the firefighters happened to be looking around, he happened to see Jeff's glove hit the glass and his hand slowly slide down the glass. They came over, they broke the window, and they pulled him out. But this was only the start. Jeff was going to need way more resilience to face what came. In the ambulance, his gear was so hot that they could not pull it off with their bare hands. They actually had to put their firefighting gloves back on to pull the equipment off of Jeff. And when the captain, actually it was the lieutenant, when the lieutenant saw his hands, he was so worried that Jeff was going to lose his hands that he took his wedding ring off to save for Jeff's wife. During the ambulance ride on the way to the hospital, Jeff lost consciousness, and he woke up 6 weeks later. 6 weeks later. And when he woke up, he was in so much pain. And very soon after he woke up, they started to rush him out again. He needed another surgery, a skin graft, and Jeff got really nervous. And he said, I'm scared. I've never had a surgery before. I've never been operated on. And the doctor kind of looked at him, and the wife kind of looked at him, and they said, Jeff, you've already had 8 surgeries, 8, while he's been unconscious. The fire burned 48% of his body. And with the skin grafts, with the way they had to harvest his skin to try to repair his back, 60% of Jeff's body ended up being exposed. All total, Jeff was unconscious for 6 weeks. He was in the intensive care unit for 3.5 months. He was then transferred to a rehabilitation hospital for a month. And even after he came home, he was a full year in physical therapy. 30 surgeries in the hospital. 30 surgeries in total. And one of the skin grafts, the major skin graft on his back, failed. There was an infection, so they had to go back in and rip off the skin graft that they had just so painstakingly surgically applied. Usually with fires, there's one cleaning a day, and that includes pulling off dead skin. As Jeff was telling me the story, my stomach was turning. I was fighting nausea as I was listening to the story. And then you sit there and you think, oh my gosh, what is it like for you to experience that story? After that infection on his back, major infection, they had to move to 2 cleanings a day. Extraordinarily painful. Jeff had to take a cocktail of painkillers just to endure those cleanings. And Jeff and his wife, Tina, displayed remarkable resilience, an impressive level of resilience. Now, part of it, Tammy, the wife, Tina, the wife, was a very, very strong woman. And Jeff was a natural optimist, a really, really nice guy. That's how people kept referring to him. A really, really nice guy. And they had an incredibly supportive family and friends, along with good neighbors and a church and the Brotherhood of the Firefighters. And Jeff and Tina both talk about that those firefighters stood by their side, Jeff and the family, the entire ordeal. And they had bad days. Both of them had bad days. They also cracked some rather inappropriate jokes, many of which they shared with me on this particular day. And they learned to accept help. Tina in particular was pretty proud. She initially struggled with that. She learned that you just simply cannot go it alone. One of the bad days, Jeff, on day 80, okay, let's just sit with that for a second. On day 80 in the hospital, in the same room, Jeff says, that's it. He said, I was losing my stuff. He said, I've been in the same bed, looking at the exact same view for 80 days. I need a change. And the hospital respected that. And they accommodated that. And they moved him to another room where he now had a completely different angle. How did he survive? How did he survive not only the fire, but the recovery? Resilience. Healthy adaptation in the face of significant adversity. And Jeff credits his internal drive, and yet also says that his family served as his motivator. And the way, again, he describes himself, he says, I'm a fighter, a psychological fighter, but when I get knocked down, I'm getting back up. Anybody here remember Weebles? Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. So the trick with resilience is not that you're not going to wobble. You are going to wobble. The trick is that you don't fall down, or even if you do, that you get back up again. And for Jeff, it was a never quit, never stop mentality. He decided, I'm going to go out fighting, because as long as I'm breathing, I have a chance. An amazing story of adversity. Okay, so now, what are some of the individual characteristics that provide protection for us during these times? Optimism. I'm going to talk about that next. Intelligence. Now, does anybody else feel like intelligence might be a little bit discriminatory? It feels odd for me to say that intelligence is a thing. I think what intelligence does is it buys us options. If I'm not that bright, I come up with one strategy, and if that doesn't work, I'm out. That's it. I'm done. But if I'm kind of bright, I come up with that first plan. It's kind of like what my father used to talk about. I come up with plan A, and if plan A doesn't work, I fall back on plan B. And if plan B fizzles out, well, then I look for plan C. I think that's what intelligence buys us. Creativity is that ability to look out, to think outside of the box. And you're going to think about some of the people in your life. There are people who are just naturally kind of better at that than others. And humor. Now, you might be thinking that's an odd picture there. John Krasinski. I happened to stumble across this a day or two ago. He has said that there's so much heavy duty, somewhat bad news, that he started a little program called Some Good News. And that's what he emphasizes. And there was a little girl recently, a 15-year-old, who got released from the hospital because she finished her last day of chemotherapy. And so her friends and neighbors lined the street, social distancing, and they clapped and they honked and they made that little girl feel like she was absolutely on top of the world. And then humor. We talked about humor. And don't knock humor. If you spend much time around cops, cops can have some pretty dark humor. Spending that time with firefighters, as can firefighters. Think about medical people. If you've ever stumbled into the room of a medical provider, an ER doctor, they've got some pretty off-color jokes there going on, and all of us tend to have that in our own field. That humor is a coping mechanism, and it is a good one. And then you've got coping strategies and social skills and educational abilities. So let's break that list down. Oh, actually, okay, let's not do that yet. Let's not. I don't want to do that yet. Let's talk optimism. Optimism is an essential component of resilience. It's that ability to maintain hope in the future, that things really will get better, that this too, my grandmother used to say, this too shall pass. It wasn't you. I thought she came up with that line when I was a child. This too shall pass. But you want to mingle it with a touch of realism. Like if you think about what we're going through right now, yes, eventually this will pass. And we will again start up our economy. And we will again be back learning in our schools. And we will again be back in our jobs and be able to socialize with our friends together. But right now we're not doing any of those things. And that's tough. And so let's have a little bit of authenticity and own that that's unpleasant. Yes, we'll get through it. But along the way, it's not our preference. And what, again, we know that optimists have that internal locus of control, that they believe in their power to affect what's going on around them. And because of that, they're not as inclined to give up easily. So let's think about Jeff and Tina, our Dallas firefighter. Optimism. They were relentless. They were so confident that they will get through, and they are going to keep fighting whatever obstacles still remain in front of them. Their intelligence. They accepted that this is a new normal. Jeff is not back 100%. There are still some limitations. He cannot be a full-blown firefighter anymore. He's now working in dispatch, and he's glad that he's there, but it's not what he signed up for. In their creativity, that changing the room 8 months in, the humor, now this is a humor that needed to have some time, but now one of the things that Jeff does to pay it forward, to show his appreciation for what the firefighting community did for him, he goes in and he talks to the new recruits. He talks to the probies. And one of the things he tells them is, I rose like a phoenix from the ashes. Okay, that's a joke that's not quite going to fly early on, but now, 4 or 5 years in, he can do that. They're coping strategies. You can't get through something of this magnitude alone. I think the same applies to every single one of us. This is an extraordinary crisis. And the impact on all of us truly is extraordinary. It is something that none of us have ever seen. I have young people saying to me, well, what did you do last time? There was no last time. This is the first time. You can't go it alone. So how can you marshal the resources around you? And then again, the social skills, they had relationships with a vast network. Here are some examples of resilience. Now, what I find encouraging about this list is knowing that there's a number of them. I'm not going to be able to do all of them. I'm not going to have every single one of these in my personal repertoire, but I can pick and choose, get a couple of them, maybe even several of them under my belt, and that's what I can charge in to this battle with. Another great example, The Martian. It doesn't all have to be real life. The Martian. Hey, remember when Matt Damon, he's stuck on Mars, and he starts becoming the first person to farm, and he says, take that, Neil Armstrong. And then he decides that he's a space pirate. Okay, so there's the humor and the creativity. But remember when Jessica Chastain realized that they needed to go back and they needed to get him. And her message was, as well as NASA's message, work the problem, people. Don't get overwhelmed by the emotion right now. Obviously, as a psychologist, I'm not suggesting that we put emotions aside forever. But in the moment, we might need to compartmentalize and deal with some of the emotion later so that we can master the crisis in front of us. And then when they realized that their projections were off and Matt was going to be flying around out there in outer space, she said, we're going to get it. And they said, well, but when we get there, there's going to be a new problem. And she said, well, then we have 39 minutes to figure out the solution to that problem. I love that. And as you think about movies, I can't believe I'm this far into this presentation and I haven't talked about movies yet. I love movies. So here's a couple of unusual, think outside the box, coping mechanisms. The Martian. This is a fabulous movie about resilience, but it's not the only one. Patriots Day, about the Boston Marathon bombing. Apollo 13, Tom Hanks, how can you go wrong? Or Deepwater Horizon. These are just some examples, and these examples can actually be inspiring to us as we see the coping strategies that other people have lived through. And sometimes we also get a little bit of perspective about what we're going through. Golly, I'm feeling a little bit cooped up inside my house versus Apollo 13, real life, we're not sure they're coming back home. So I think sometimes it also can help give us perspective. And in The Martian, after Matt Damon, I'm going to give a spoiler alert. After Matt Damon lives and he comes back to Earth, he too goes back and speaks to the rookie astronauts. I don't know what you call that, but whatever that is, whatever you call that. And he says, at some point, everything's going to go south on you. And you can either accept that or you can get to work. And if you get to work, you solve that first problem. And then you solve the next. And if you solve enough problems, you get to come home. And what I love about that is that you are solving the immediate problem in front of you, because the whole entire task might be so overwhelming and so defiant of my ability to break down that entire problem that I'm overwhelmed there. If I can break it into manageable chunks, then I can solve this problem. And once that one's behind me, now I can solve this problem. One of the phrases that I use a lot is, let's jump off that bridge when we get there. So let's focus right now on the bridge that we're on. How do I manage this? And tomorrow, If I'm up against a new problem, if I'm on a new bridge, well, then I'm going to figure out that solution tomorrow. And let's not overwhelm ourselves today with what's still coming down the road. There was a study on terrorism and PTSD in Israel. I'm now going to bounce back to my Israel program. And they studied two different areas in Israel that were both facing terror attacks. One was Sderot. I actually mentioned this town last week. They have a lower socioeconomic status. They have fewer economic and fewer psychological resources. Then they studied a kibbutz. A kibbutz is a collective where people band together as a community. And what they found there was that the kibbutz had more of a solid economic structure. And there was more mutual support because it was a collective. They literally banded together. And what they found in the study is that the characteristics of the community can also be a strong predictor of PTSD and depression. So what we want to pay attention to is not just the exposure and the distress, but the relationship between that and our community resources and support networks, and make sure that we're bolstering both. And what they found in this study is that the way to mitigate the mental health response, which a lot of us are talking about in this, is to enrich community resources, to have our resources available, to have a general sense of support, and then to have some sense of solidarity. So if you think about this school community, whether it's Glen Ellen, whether it's the DuPage regional office, we are committed, I said we, they are committed to continuing to feed our needy families. They are committed to continuing to teach our children. They are committed to continuing to provide resources for those who are struggling. That's what I'm talking about. Apply these studies to what we're up against now. Dr. Nuttman-Shwartz, I mentioned her last week. She is one of my partners in Israel. She's actually the chief social worker for Israel and a professor at Sapir College, which is actually in Sderot, the town we were just talking about. She talks to my group about the fact that over a 15-year period, over 10,000 missiles were fired at the Israelis. Sometimes as many as 50 a day. I truly cannot fathom. But one of Dr. Nuttman-Shwartz's strategies and what the research supports is the need to return to normality as soon as possible. So picture this. Dr. Nuttman-Shwartz is teaching a college class. The sirens sound that a missile is heading towards them. They shelter. On the college campus, they can't make it to a bomb shelter, so they're literally under a table. And they're under that table, and after the missiles hit, they look around at each other, they do kind of a check-in. You okay? You okay? You okay? Maybe a couple of people call their families. Are you guys okay? And then Dr. Nuttman-Shwartz starts to teach again. She resumes class because they want to return to normality as soon as possible. Think about that as we structure our days. I don't want you to think that Monday through Friday is a vacation just because we're not at work or just because we're not in our classrooms. So we want to have some structure. We want to have a bedtime. We want to have a time that we're getting up in the morning and our meals and our study times and our classes or our work, whatever that is. But Dr. Nuttman-Shwartz talks about how you navigate trauma. And she too emphasizes the value, the significance of community and relationships. But she also talks about the fact that it's important to acknowledge dual roles. So for her, she's a mom, but she's also a therapist. She has students who might also be her client. So think about us. Think about our medical professionals on the front line. Yes, they are doctors and they are nurses, but they're also husbands and wives and brothers and sisters and daughters and sons and moms and dads. So they've got that duality to the situation, which most of us have in some way or other. And we want to acknowledge that that is part of the reality of the situation that we're in. And finally, the research actually upholds the value of religion as a protective factor, that it helps people cope. Now, that's a bit of a challenge for us right now because in America, we are closing our houses of worship, or quite frankly, most of them probably already are closed. But what we're finding again is the resilience, is the adaptability, is the thinking outside the box. A lot of these churches are holding, or mosques or synagogues are holding their services online. And if yours does not, you might want to look around to find another church or another mosque or another synagogue that does. Bottom line, we want to promote resilience. And there are multiple and sometimes unexpected factors. There's the situational factor, like supportive relationships. But there's also individual factors, like my capacity for adaptive flexibility. And surviving in the face of crisis. Let's bring it back to Jeff Patterson again, the Dallas Fire and Rescue person, the firefighter. He had, before the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis, a never quit attitude. And he actually said it. I was taking copious notes. He wasn't even necessarily aware of that's just how he approaches life. Never quit. And his definition of tough again, and I love the fact that his definition of tough isn't that he always stays on his feet. He was a defensive linebacker. So he's used to getting knocked off his feet. For him, being tough meant, I'm going to stand back up. That never stop mentality. I'm going to keep fighting as long as I have a breath. I'm going to keep fighting, but you can't do it alone. It takes a village. Here's one of my all-time favorite quotes, and it absolutely applies with regards to resilience. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day that says, I will try again tomorrow. I was talking to a good friend of mine last night. She was having a bad day. Okay, so we'll help her get through that. And today, she'll get back into the fight. She'll enter the ring again. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day that simply says, that whispers, I will try again tomorrow. So here are my questions. Here's my contact information. I got to show you my references. I want to make sure that you don't think that I was plagiarizing. And at this point, let's end on this note, and I will turn it over to whoever to start with the question and answer period. I think that's Mike.
All right, Mike, unmute yourself.
There you go.
There you go.
Well, first, let me say that we are open for questions now at DuPage Strong, at DUPAGE Strong, at DuPageROE.org. And a reminder that this has been recorded and will be available on the DuPage ROE and District 41 websites on our YouTube channels, along with a list of resources available, which are posted as well. And I'd like to also acknowledge that we should mention we are in a slightly different format tonight, exercising our own social distancing, which is why we are not all together. And I'll turn that over to Dr. Kaskowski if you want to say a little bit more about that.
Sure. Just want to share with our community that we're taking very seriously our obligation to social distancing. So we did not want to put people together in the room tonight. We respected those 6 feet distances last week when we met, but just as this situation escalates, we wanted to send a message that it's very important for everybody to be committed to social distancing and also committed to not taking any unnecessary chances or risks. So we came up with a different format, and we will probably use this again next time.
Okay, so I'll start in with a few questions. First one has to deal with remote learning. So perhaps Dr. Rossetti or Dr. Kaskowski. So what's really changed with remote learning versus extended learning or activities from a school or a student's perspective?
Right. I'm glad to take it. And Darlene, if I miss anything, please jump in and correct me. When we first started, when the mandated closure happened, we were put on what was called Active God Days. For those of us who had e-learning plans, those plans were developed with the intention of being used for the random snow day, cold weather day, but not for a long-term closure. Those e-learning days that were Active God did not need to be made up. We were to give kids continued access to learning opportunities, and we were not required to monitor attendance. Now the directive has shifted, and we are entering into, for District 41, will be next Monday when we come off of spring break, and these will be considered remote learning days. So the criteria for remote learning days have changed a bit. There's more of a focus on instruction. Teachers are engaging with students in all sorts of ways, but for districts who have the ability to do that using technology, on these remote learning days, you will see a heightened level of virtual learning and technology tools being used in the context of instruction. Teachers will be engaging with students to do reteaching and provide feedback. We will be monitoring attendance and participation in remote learning. And again, there is a high focus on engagement and maintaining that connection for kids between home and school. But I believe people will feel some subtle differences from e-learning now that we're transitioning into remote learning.
I would just add that I think there was a lot of continuity between the Act of God days and now the remote learning days. And I would also say one piece of that continuity was the focus too that our educators and our teachers brought to social emotional learning, trying to really focus on, you know what, this is challenging for kids. This is different for kids. How do we, help them as well too, not just with their academic, but also their social emotional learning supports as well.
I would add to that as we've seen what's going on across the county, there are some amazing things that educators are pulling off, and we'd like to thank all of them for their efforts at this time. Next question, perhaps Dr. Zarse or anyone, I guess. Talking about a return to normalcy of some type for children. My children want to be outside and playing with their neighbors. They generally stay in the small same group each day. Can we continue this both medically, which we of course can't answer too well, but also from a mental health perspective?
Those are two separate issues. Medically, the information is pretty clear we cannot. That the social distancing needs to be extreme, and for a number of reasons. One, what we hear from the medical experts is that thought that we had in the beginning that the people over 60 were particularly vulnerable and that young people seem to have some natural immunity is just plain not true. That is not borne out. I think I've heard 40% of hospitalizations are people under the age of 40. Secondly, recent data this very week is that as many as 25% of people are completely asymptomatic at all, and they still carry the virus and they are contagious. So and so those young children, if children are getting together, not only are we risking the health of those children, but we're risking the households that those children return back to. So no, the shelter in place really is in place. Now, out in your backyard, the mental health piece is a different piece, but medically, my sense, and you guys tell me what you think, my sense is no.
Right. I would agree. That's how we're cautioning people. You don't know who's running out to go to the grocery store and who you're encountering when you're at the grocery store or who's coming over to visit someone's house. So even though it's the same group of students, you don't know who those kids are encountering when they go back home or when they're out in the community running around. I think all you have to do is drive through most towns and you'll clearly see people that are out and about. And I'm not certain they're all doing crucial business, so we're really encouraging our community to take, a strict stance on this. And, our campuses are closed, our buildings are closed to everyone, and that's our way of impacting this. So control what we can control, and that's the degree to which you social distance.
And I would also add on the mental health part of this, it's what you've been talking about tonight, Dr. Zarse. It's like, how are we coping with this? What type of strategies can we be using? There is so much. And, Mike talked about the great things that teachers are doing. They're sharing different strategies. Parents are sharing different kind of things. I did this with my kid today. For example, I started reading to my grandchildren. We're using Zoom and I'm reading to my grandchildren every night. I've now included puppets. So now we do that. And my husband's making sound effects in the background. Obviously, they're very little and I do not have any teenagers or anything, but I think it's exactly what you've been talking about here.
And it's that creativity. Rather than playing together, can you do a game via Zoom? Can you be 6 feet apart but yet also not exchanging a ball or anything? So think about the 6 feet as literal and rigid, but what are the ways that we can be creative around that? Can they be, and not just video games, although, some video games is fine. There's YouTube abilities now that you can watch movies together, but in separate houses. Okay, that's technology. It's above me, but people are doing it.
Mhm.
That's what we recommend. You need to be creative, but that 6 feet needs to be rigid.
Agree.
The next one has to deal with children again, but slightly older age. And again, it's multiple questions. Wondering if the professionals think we will go back to school at all this year. And the second question, as a part of that, I'm wondering how to support my child who is a senior and is afraid she's going to miss out on prom and graduation because of this crisis.
I'm just going to jump in real quick and just make a blanket statement. I think the most important thing this year is that if we do, when we do, it's safe to go back to school. I think that's the number one criteria that we need to think about. It's not the when, it's are we safe?
And then I'll jump in on the senior who's worried about losing things. Let's own that. So the one thing is the safety. We're going to maintain safe guidelines. But the other is hearing that in the midst of that reality does not change her emotional experience. So let's give her the time and space to grieve. She is facing, if those things get canceled, they're not yet, but if prom gets canceled, if graduation gets canceled, that is a loss. And let her feel that, and we need to hear that. We need to be able to listen to that separate from the safety guidelines that we're going to enforce. You see the difference? It's actually two separate issues.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to jump in and share. I agree that I want us to come back when it's safe for us to come back, but also to assure that every superintendent out there is thinking of those things. And the last thing that any of us want to have happen is for kids to lose out on opportunities. So while we can't answer the question of when we'll be back or what may or may not be canceled, please know that all of us are working behind the scenes to talk about ways to reschedule, redo, do differently, and all kinds of things so that kids don't lose out. So
If
those conversations are well underway and happening daily.
And if you notice, there are a couple of strategies at play there. The first thing is, let's instill in our children a little bit of faith that the adults that are in charge are taking that charge very, very seriously and are balancing the safety guidelines with the losses. And if the safety guidelines dictate a certain course of action because it's, safe, then they're going to also try to be creative and look at some of these same concepts of resilience that we've talked about tonight to see, is there a way that we can try to be creative in how we lessen that loss? But I think it's important to instill in our children to have some faith.
Okay, the next question has to do with special education needs. So educators and perhaps our legal expert. My child receives special education services from the school district, but recently it has been very limited. I believe the teachers are doing the best they can, but how will my child's needs be met during this stay-at-home time, particularly if this time extends for a lengthy period of time?
So that's a good question. I know that it's on everyone's mind, both parents and educators alike. Like, how are we going to meet the needs of special ed kids? And I wish there was a better answer, but it is going to look different. And we're going to be looking at what everyone's been saying, looking at creative ways to present instruction, to make accommodations, to make connections with kids. And like for the general ed population, what the special ed population is receiving is not going to be exactly the same as what we're used to. But we are going to, we have counseled all our clients, and all our clients are 100% in, and all school districts I've heard about are 100% in to really working to provide meaningful opportunities for special ed kids to continue. And that's a commitment that I think the state has made and our local school districts have made as well.
I think in District 41, and I'm going to have to take this opportunity to say a thank you to Mike Wood, not only for helping us to figure this out tonight, but helping us to figure out what tools are out there, what tools do we have, what tools do we need to get so that we can work differently with students. This is pushing, I think, everybody well beyond not only, outside of your comfort zone, but we're also finding that there are so many great things out there that allow us to stay connected with kids, but there is no doubt that it looks different. So, and we connect in terms of across DuPage and even outside of DuPage, almost on a daily basis. People are sharing resources. Hey, I tried, Google Voice, I tried this. So the amount of sharing that's happening is just incredible. So as people try something and it works really well for them, they're sharing and recommending that to other people. So it's something that, depending on how long this goes, I believe it's going to change throughout as people discover new tools. And the key here, I think, is going to be technology. And then when we come back, because eventually we will, how do we resolve some of those things that we just absolutely couldn't do? So all of those conversations are happening.
Yeah, that's an important point. Like, this is not going to be forever. And we know that schools are going to be ready to meet kids when they come back with where they are. And that's true of anything. I mean, you think of kids, individual kids have faced illness, they've faced, adversity at home, they've been out of school for periods of time for various reasons. And now it's happening universally, but we can address that in the way that we always have, is by when they come back, being ready to assess needs and put services in place that will get them back on the path to making progress and learning new things and just reaching their potential. And that's something that is something in the future. And it takes me back to what Dr. Zarse says, is you sort of handle one problem at a time. We're going to try to make the best that we can do right now. And when we come back, if there's something that needs to be solved again, we're going to stand ready and solve it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I know that Dr. Rossetti and Dr. Kaskowski, you had mentioned some of the efforts going on across DuPage County. And as we are involved at the ROE with the school safety administrators, with the different health organizations, with the Department of Homeland Security, with all of our educational agencies, with all of our social and emotional supports, I think it's assuring to know, for those who don't know all of the work that goes on behind the scenes, that the preparation that's taking place and how well prepared not only we are in DuPage County. Of course, you can't be prepared for everything, but that it's also not just from a county level, but from across the state level, the conversations and the preparation that's gone into putting us in that place. So we have no more questions. So if anyone wants to engage in some closing comments, the floor is open.
Just want to thank everyone, and we'll see you next Wednesday. Have a good evening.
Everybody.
Good night. Stay safe. Be prepared. Be resilient.